The sun was setting over the small town of Willowbrook, casting a golden hue over the quiet streets. James Saturday on his porch, watching the world move slowly around him. It had been a long day of errands, and he was finally able to sit and relax. His mind often wandered to the past, especially to the mistakes he had made, the things he wished he could take back. But today was different. He felt a calm peace within himself, a sense of clarity that had been missing for so long. James had always been hard on himself. He was the kind of person who would replay conversations and actions in his head, analyzing what he could have done differently. It wasn't just the big decisions that troubled him, but the small ones too, little things that, at that time, seemed insignificant but in hindsight, he knew had mattered. His biggest regret was the time he had lost with his family, especially with his sister, Emily. Emily had been the younger sibling, the one who always looked up to him. They had grown up close, sharing secrets and dreams for the future. But as they got older, things changed. James got busy with his career, and Emily went off to college, chasing her own dreams. The distance between them grew, both physical and emotional. James had made excuses, telling himself that it was just a phase, that they would reconnect when things settled down. But time kept passing, and the gap between them only widened. Then, one day, Emily stopped calling. She stopped visiting. At first, James thought it was just a busy time in her life, but weeks turned into months. He sent texts and left voicemails, but there was no response. His worry grew, but so did his frustration. Why hadn't she made an effort to reach out? Was it something he had done? The more he thought about it, the more he blamed himself. Maybe he hadn't been there for her when she needed him most. Maybe he had taken her for granted. It wasn't until one evening, nearly a year later, that he received a call from their mother. The news hit him like a ton of bricks. Emily had been in an accident. It wasn't serious, but it was enough to leave her in the hospital for a few days. James rushed to her side, guilt gnawing at him the whole way there. When he arrived, Emily was awake and sitting up in bed, looking more annoyed than injured. As he walked into the room, their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. "Hey," James finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hey," Emily replied, her tone colder than he expected. He sat her down beside her, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. "I've been trying to reach you. Why didn't you tell me what happened?" Emily shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to feel guilty." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I do feel guilty," he admitted. "I've been a terrible brother. I should have been there for you." Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, he saw the sister he had missed so much. "James, it's not just your fault. I didn't make it easy. I pushed you away because I didn't want to be a burden. I thought you had your own life, and I didn't want to get in the way." The silence between them hung heavy for a moment. Then, James reached out and took her hand. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I've realized that I've been holding on to guilt, trying to make up for something I can change. But maybe the best thing we can do now is just forgive each other and move forward." Emily's eyes softened. "I think I'm ready for that." From that day forward, James and Emily began to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when old habits crept in, but they made a conscious effort to stay connected. They called each other more often, planned visits, and most importantly, they started to understand that neither of them was perfect. They had both made mistakes, but they also had the power to forgive, and in doing so, they healed. As James sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized that the past no longer had a hold on him. He had made mistakes, but he had also learned from them. Forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the past, it was about giving himself and others the freedom to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. James Carter never thought he would be the cause of a disaster. He had always been careful, always made the right decisions, but even the best of men could falter, and he was no exception. It started with a single miscalculation. James, an engineer aboard the colony ship Endeavour, was responsible for maintaining the ship's navigation system. The ship carried over 1,000 people, all of whom had placed their trust in him and the rest of the crew. They were headed to a new world, a fresh start for humanity among the stars. One night, exhausted and distracted, James inputted a minor coordinate adjustment. It should have been routine, but in this a decimal point, and that tiny mistake sent the ship drifting slightly off course. It wasn't noticeable at first. The crew carried on, unaware that they were heading straight for an asteroid field. The alarms blared just hours later. The ship AI detected the field too late for a smooth course correction. The pilot tried to steer the Endeavour away, but the damage had already been done. A cluster of small asteroids struck the hull, breaching a cargo bay. Panic spread as the ship's structure groaned under the impact. James knew the moment he saw the readings. His heart pounded as he realized the truth. His mistake had led them here. He ran to the bridge, ready to confess, but before he could, the captain, Elise Morgan, ordered immediate action. The damage control team sealed the compromised section, preventing further loss of oxygen. Still, the ship had suffered serious harm. Their fuel reserves were hit, and they no longer had enough to reach their original destination. They had no choice but to land on the nearest habitable planet, a world never meant to be their home. The days that followed were filled with struggle. The settlers worked together, building shelters and securing food. Supplies were limited, and morale was low. James stayed silent, guilt gnawing at him. He worked harder than anyone, trying to make up for what he had done. But inside, he feared what would happen if the truth came out. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Captain Morgan called a meeting. She stood before the tired, worried settlers and spoke with quiet strength. "We have all lost something in this journey," she said. "Our home, our plans, our certainty. But we are still alive, and we still have each other, and that means we can rebuild." James Saturday among the crowd, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to speak up. He had to. He couldn't carry this secret any longer. He stood, his voice shaking. "Captain, everyone, I need to say something." All eyes turned to him. He swallowed hard. "The accident. It was my fault. I made a mistake in the navigation system. If I had double-checked, we wouldn't have crashed." Silence followed. James felt the weight of their stares. Then a voice broke the quiet. "We all make mistakes, James." It was Captain Morgan. "What matters is what we do after them." Another voice spoke up. "You've been working harder than any of us. None of us blame you." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Relief flooded James, but it was not because he was free of blame. It was because they had chosen to forgive him. Over time, the settlers turned their struggle into success. They built homes, grew food, and learned to survive. And James, now free of his guilt, became a leader among them. He taught others what he had learned, ensuring no one made the same mistake again. Years later, when a rescue ship finally arrived, some chose to leave, but many stayed. This planet had become their home, and James, once defined by his error, was now remembered for his resilience. In the end, humanity's greatest strength was not in never failing, but in learning, forgiving, and moving forward together. It was a warm autumn day when Jason found himself standing at the edge of the small, quiet town he had left behind years ago. He never thought he'd return, but life had a funny way of pushing people back to places they thought they'd forgotten. The old house where he grew up was still there, though a little more rundown than he remembered. The paint on the porch was peeling, and the front yard had more weeds than grass. As Jason took a deep breath, the familiar scent of pine trees mixed with the earthy smell of damp soil, reminding him of his childhood. Jason had left this town the moment he turned 18. He had dreams of something bigger, a life away from the small town routine. He found a job in the city, started making a name for himself, and quickly became immersed in the fast-paced life. But over the years, as the city grew and his responsibilities increased, he found himself making mistakes, small ones at first, missing a family event here or there, letting relationships slide. But then the mistakes grew bigger. He lied to people he cared about, ignored the things that mattered, and ultimately pushed away the one person who had always been there for him, his mother. After years of distance, Jason finally realized that he had lost something precious. The weight of his regrets pressed down on him more and more as time passed. He tried to fix things by sending the occasional text or giving a quick call, but it was never enough. His mistakes were too many, and the hurt he had caused ran deep. He knew he had to come back to make amends before it was too late. The moment Jason stepped onto the familiar dirt road leading to his house, he felt like he was stepping back in time. It was as though nothing had changed, yet everything was different. He had changed. His mother, on the other hand, was still the same strong, caring woman who had always put others before herself. But Jason knew he had taken that for granted for too long. He hesitated for a moment at the front door, his heart racing. Would she even want to see him? Would she be angry? Would she forgive him for all the years he had been gone and all the hurt he had caused? He took a deep breath, knocked, and waited. The door creaked open, and there she was, his mother, older now, but still with the same warmth in her eyes. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and pulled him into a hug. It was like nothing had ever changed. "I've missed you," she whispered, her voice shaky. Jason felt the tears well up in his eyes. He hadn't realized how much he had missed her, how much he had needed her. All the mistakes, all the years of silence, suddenly felt insignificant compared to this moment. "I'm sorry," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've made so many mistakes. I don't know if you can forgive me." His mother pulled back slightly, looking at him with understanding. "You were just lost, Jason. I've always known you'd find your way back. Forgiveness isn't always easy, but it's always possible." Jason looked at her, unsure if he truly deserved her forgiveness. "I heard you. I left you. I didn't even try to understand what you were going through. You were young," she said softly. "You were trying to figure out who you were, and I always understood that. You've learned a lot since then, and we both know that people can change." Jason swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. His mistakes weren't the end of everything. There was still a chance to rebuild, to make things right. He had a long road ahead, but his mother's forgiveness had given him the strength to try. They Saturday together on the old porch, talking for hours. Jason apologized for every moment he had taken her for granted, for every time he had let her down. His mother listened, her forgiveness unconditional, and in that moment, Jason realized that the power of mistakes wasn't in how badly they hurt, but in how they could be healed. Forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of anger or resentment. It was about understanding, learning, and growing. As the sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the town, Jason knew he had made the right choice by returning. It wasn't just about fixing what he had broken. It was about finding a way to be better. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. His mistakes weren't the end of his story. They were just a part of it. And with his mother by his side, Jason was ready to start the next chapter, one built on forgiveness and the power to change. It was a chilly morning in a small, quiet town where everything seemed to move at a slow, peaceful pace. People walked down cobblestone streets, sipping their coffee as the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a soft glow on the old brick buildings. Among the usual bustle, there was a young man named Jake, who lived in a modest apartment above a little bookstore. He was like many of the people in the town, friendly, hardworking, and always ready to lend a hand. But there was something more to Jake, something he had been carrying with him for years. Jake had made a mistake long ago, one that haunted him every single day. It was a mistake that had hurt the people he loved most, and despite all his efforts to move forward, it was a mistake he couldn't seem to let go of. The guilt weighed heavily on his chest, and no matter how hard he tried to make up for it, it never felt like enough. The mistake had happened during a time when Jake was young and foolish. He had been in a relationship with a woman named Sarah, someone he had deeply cared for. They had been happy for a while, but as time went on, Jake started to take things for granted. He became distant and careless, ignoring Sarah's needs and not appreciating what he had until it was too late. One evening, after a heated argument, Sarah walked out of his life for good. Jake didn't realize how much he had hurt her until it was over. She was gone, and no apology, no gesture, could bring her back. Years passed, and Jake moved on. He built a life for himself in the town, made new friends, and found a routine that kept him busy. But deep inside, There was a part of him that still regretted his actions. Every time he passed the old coffee shop they used to visit, every time he heard a song that reminded him of her, the pain resurfaced. It was like an old wound that never fully healed. One morning, as Jake was walking to the bookstore, he saw someone familiar standing outside. At first, he didn't recognize her, but then it hit him. It was Sarah. She was standing there, looking just as beautiful as he remembered, though there was a sadness in her eyes that made his heart ache. She had changed over the years, but there was no mistaking her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Time seemed to slow down as Jake searched for the right words, but they never came. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "Jake," she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's been a long time." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "It has." There was a long pause before Sarah spoke again. "I've been thinking about the past, about everything that happened between us. I know I've never truly forgiven you, but I've realized something. Holding on to the anger, the hurt, it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help me, and it certainly doesn't help you." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent so many years feeling sorry for himself, thinking that he didn't deserve forgiveness, that he didn't deserve a second chance. But hearing her words made him realize how much he had been wrong. Forgiveness wasn't just about him. It was about both of them moving forward. "I never stopped caring about you," Jake said, his voice shaky. "I never meant to hurt you. I was an idiot, and I know that now. I wish I could take it all back." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening. "I know you do, and I think it's time for both of us to let go of the past. We can't change what happened, but we can move forward, free from the weight of it." Jake swallowed hard. He had spent years carrying the guilt of that mistake, and now, standing before Sarah, he realized that it was finally time to forgive himself, too. A smile smited at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. "Thank you for giving me that chance." Sarah smiled back, her eyes brightening. "We all make mistakes, Jake. The important thing is that we learn from them and don't let them define us." For the first time in years, Jake felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't going to be easy to move on from the past, but he knew that the first step had been taken. They had both forgiven each other, and with that, they had found a way to heal. As they stood there, the morning sun casting a warm glow on the street, it felt like the beginning of something new. The past was no longer a burden, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt hopeful. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had learned, and now, with Sarah by his side, he knew that the future could be brighter than he ever imagined. It had been a quiet evening in the small town of Cedar Grove. The streets were calm, the sky teemed with the soft orange of a setting sun. In one of the Council homes on Elm Street, a man named Mark Saturday in his living room, staring at the wall, lost in thought. The room was filled with the faint hum of a television. He wasn't watching. The weight of the past few months pressed heavily on him, and he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Just a few weeks ago, everything had seemed perfect. Mark had a good job, a loving wife, and two beautiful children, but that had all changed in an instant, when a mistake he had made turned everything upside down. His company had been facing some financial issues, and one day, under pressure from his boss, Mark had made a decision that he thought was harmless, but ended up causing a major setback. The mistake wasn't just a small misstep, it had cost the company a significant amount of money. The consequences were far-reaching, affecting his team and, in turn, his family. Mark had never been the type of person to avoid responsibility. He knew he had made a mistake, and he owned it. He apologized to his boss, to his coworkers, and to his family. But what hurt the most was the look on his wife's face when he told her what had happened. She was disappointed, not because she didn't believe in him, but because she had never expected him to make such an error in judgment. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and guilt. Mark tried to make up for what had happened, working overtime, doing everything he could to fix the situation, but the damage had been done. His children noticed the change too. His son, Daniel, who was only 7, had stopped asking him to play catch in the yard. His daughter, Emma, who was 5, no longer wanted to draw pictures of their family. The smiles had faded, and the warmth that used to fill the house felt distant. One evening, after another long day at work, Mark Saturday on the porch, watching the last of the daylight slip away. The air was cool, and the crickets had started their nightly chorus. As he stared at the sky, a familiar voice broke the silence. "You okay, Mark?" It was Rachel, his wife. She had come to sit beside him. Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply sighed, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You've been quiet lately," Rachel said, her voice gentle but filled with concern. "I don't know how to fix it," Mark admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've tried everything, but it doesn't feel like enough." Rachel reached over and took his hand. "You've been hard on yourself. We all make mistakes, Mark. What matters is how we move forward from them." Mark turned to her, his eyes filled with doubt. "But what if I can't fix it? What if I've ruined everything?" Rachel smiled softly. "You haven't ruined anything. Yes, things have changed, but that doesn't mean they're broken beyond repair. We're still a family, and we still love each other. It's okay to make mistakes, as long as you learn from them." Her words were simple, but they hit Mark like a wave of relief. He realized that while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, it wasn't the end. It was just a bump in the road. He had to forgive himself, and he had to allow his family to forgive him too. The next day, Mark decided to take a different approach. He apologized to his children, not with grand words, but with small, meaningful actions. He spent time with them, playing games, helping them with their homework, and even taking Daniel to the park for a game of catch. Slowly, things began to change. The tension that had once filled the house started to lift. Emma began drawing pictures again, and Daniel's laughter returned to the backyard. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Mark learned that sometimes mistakes weren't just about the consequences. They were about the opportunity to grow, to show up and do better. He learned that forgiveness, both from others and from himself, was the key to moving forward. By the end of the month, things had improved. Mark had managed to fix the financial issue at work, and the company was on a steady path to recovery. But more importantly, his family was whole again. There was a warmth in their home that hadn't been there before, a sense of understanding and resilience that had come from the hardships they had faced together. As Mark sat down to dinner with his family that evening, he looked around the table at his wife and children, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. He had made a mistake, but he had learned from it. He had been forgiven, and in turn, he had forgiven himself, and that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. In a small, quiet town, nestled among rolling hills and thick forests, there lived a man named James. He was an ordinary man, not particularly wealthy or famous, but he had something that most people didn't: an extraordinary ability to see things from different perspectives. He had always been a kind person, generous with his time, and always ready to lend a hand. However, one mistake he made years ago would shape the rest of his life. It all started on a sunny morning in the summer. James had been working at a local factory, making a modest living, when a new employee named Sarah joined the team. She was young, full of energy, and eager to prove herself. Everyone liked her immediately, but James noticed something different about her. She reminded him of his younger self, full of potential but unsure of how to navigate the adult world. They began talking, and over time, a friendship formed. One day, an important project came in, and James, who was known for his experience, was put in charge of leading it. He knew that the team would have to work hard to meet the deadlines, and he wanted to make sure everything went smoothly. Sarah, eager to contribute, approached him with an idea that she thought could improve the project. It was a good idea, one that could save the company time and money, but James, feeling the pressure of the responsibility and thinking he knew best, dismissed her suggestion without a second thought. "Stick to the plan," he said curtly. "It's not time to experiment." Sarah was taken aback, but she respected James enough not to argue. She went along with the plan, even though she knew it wasn't the best approach. The project moved forward, but as the days passed, it became clear that the decision to ignore Sarah's suggestion was a mistake. The project began to fall behind schedule, and the quality of the work suffered. James felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. After several days of struggle, he finally had to face the truth. The project was in trouble, and it was his fault. He knew that if he had listened to Sarah, things would have gone differently. The thought of losing the respect of his colleagues and failing in front of his boss was almost too much to bear. But what hurt the most was that he had let down someone who had trusted him. James decided to do something that wasn't easy for him. He went to Sarah, who had been working hard despite her doubts, and apologized. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice sincere. "I should have listened to you. I was too focused on trying to control everything. I was wrong." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, a smile that seemed to erase all the tension between them. "It's okay," she said softly. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is that you realized it, and that's what matters." James felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He didn't expect her forgiveness to be so easy, but he was grateful for it. Over the next few weeks, he worked with Sarah, incorporating her ideas into the project. Together, they managed to get it back on track, finishing it on time and with better results than they had hoped. It wasn't just a success for the company. It was a personal victory for both of them. As the project ended, James realized that his mistake had taught him something invaluable. He had learned that it wasn't just about making the right decisions, but about how you handled the mistakes you inevitably made. It was easy to let pride stand in the way of growth, but true strength came from acknowledging when you were wrong and having the humility to make things right. The experience changed James. He became a better leader, one who valued the input of others and wasn't afraid to admit when he was wrong. The relationship between him and Sarah blossomed into a deep friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. As the years went by, James found himself making fewer mistakes, but when they did happen, he faced them with a sense of clarity and wisdom. And Sarah, she went on to become one of the most respected members of the team, her ideas and contributions shaping the future of the company. But she never forgot the lesson James had taught her that mistakes were not the end, but the beginning of something better. In the end, James learned that the true power of mistakes wasn't in the failure itself, but in the way you chose to rise from it. Forgiveness, both of yourself and others, was the key to moving forward, and that was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Ethan Walker had always been skeptical of humanity's potential. He had seen too much greed, too much selfishness. He believed that people were incapable of real change. But everything changed when the Andari arrived. The Andari were an advanced alien species, arriving in massive ships that cast shadows over entire cities. Unlike the invaders of fiction, they didn't come to conquer. They came to observe, to learn. They believed that humanity had potential, but they also saw the flaws. They saw the wars, the corruption, the pain people inflicted on each other. Ethan worked as a researcher in one of the human Andari cooperation programs. His job was to show the Andari that humanity could be better than their history suggested. It was an impossible task. Then came the mistake. One day, a misunderstanding between human scientists and the Andari led to an accident. A miscalculation in a joint experiment caused a massive explosion in a research facility. 2 Andari scientists were killed, and many others were injured. The Andari were furious. "This is what we feared," one of their leaders, Lauren, said coldly. "You act first, think later. You were reckless, unable to take responsibility." The Earth's leaders held emergency meetings. The Andari spoke of cutting all ties with humanity, possibly even leaving for good. Ethan sat in silence, feeling the weight of the failure. This wasn't just about an experiment gone wrong. This was about proving whether humans were worth trusting. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt helpless. Maybe the Andari were right. Maybe humans didn't deserve another chance. But then something unexpected happened. Families of the injured Andari and the human scientists who had survived came together. They didn't blame each other. Instead, they mourned together. They supported one another. Ethan saw a human woman holding the hand of an Andari scientist, both of them crying over their lost colleagues. Ethan knew what had to be done. He stood before the Andari Council, a group of their wisest leaders, and spoke with a clarity he had never felt before. "We made a mistake," he admitted, "a terrible one, and you have every reason to walk away, but you also have the power to forgive. Not because we deserve it, but because we can be better. That's what makes us human or fall. We fail, but we learn." Lauren looked at him for a long time. The silence in the room was unbearable. Then, finally, the honorary leader spoke. Perhaps you are right, Ethan Walker, not because you claim to be better, but because you wish to be. It wasn't an immediate fix. It took months of hard work, of rebuilding trust, but in the end, the honorary didn't leave. They stayed, not because humans were perfect, but because they saw something no other species had: a willingness to admit faults, to seek forgiveness, and to grow stronger because of it. Ethan had once doubted humanity's worth. Now, he believed in it more than ever.